She died in South Carolina, and the investigation into her death is ongoing. Her family is asking for privacy as they grieve. Panettiere was also a philanthropist, launching Hoplon International to raise money and aid for Ukrainians after Russia's invasion.
Hayden Panettiere spent almost her entire life in front of an audience. She was a familiar face before most people her age had finished elementary school, and by the time she turned 36, she had lived through more highs and lows than most performers see in a full career. On August 16, 2026, that long, public journey came to a sudden and shocking end. Her death sent ripples through Hollywood and across the millions of homes where people had grown up watching her, and it reopened conversations she herself had spent years trying to have honestly about fame, addiction, motherhood, and the cost of growing up in the spotlight. Panettiere's rise began almost before she could remember it starting. She appeared in commercials as a small child and had television and film credits by the time she was in single digits, including early roles on soap operas and in family films. Audiences got to know her more widely through roles like the one in Remember the Titans, and she lent her voice to the character in the animated film A Bug's Life. Those early jobs gave her a foothold in an industry that does not always make room for people to grow up gradually. For Panettiere, childhood and career were tangled together from the very beginning. Her biggest breakthrough came when she was cast as Claire Bennett on the NBC series Heroes at just 17 years old. Claire was a teenager with the ability to heal from almost any injury, and the role turned Panettiere into one of the most recognizable young actresses on television. A few years later, she stepped into an entirely different kind of part, playing Juliet Barnes on the musical drama Nashville, a country star wrestling with fame, family strain, and the music business. The role let her show off her singing as well as her acting, and it earned her 2 Golden Globe nominations. She also became known to horror fans through the Scream franchise, playing Kirby Reed, a character she later returned to after taking time away from acting to focus on her personal life. That time away was not simply a career pause. Panettiere has said publicly that she stepped back to work on her mental health, her physical health, and what she described as her overall well-being. Coming back to acting, including her role in the psychological thriller Sleepwalker, which was released in January 2026, was as much a personal milestone as a professional one. Around the same time, she was also promoting a memoir, This Is Me, A Reckoning, published in May 2026, in which she wrote candidly about the parts of her life that rarely made it into red carpet interviews. In the years leading up to her death, Panettiere had become one of the more openly honest public figures about the darker sides of fame. She spoke about experiencing severe postpartum depression after the birth of her daughter, Kaya, and about a long struggle with alcohol and opioid use that she said left her feeling, at points, like she no longer recognized herself. In 2018, she made the difficult decision to give up custody of Kaya, a choice she has described as one of the most painful of her life. Rather than keep that chapter hidden, she chose in later years to talk about it, saying she wanted other parents struggling with similar issues to know they were not alone and that asking for help was not something to be ashamed of. Her memoir also revisited an unsettling experience from when she was 18 years old, during a trip aboard a yacht in the south of France. She wrote about being led by someone she trusted into a small cabin, where she found herself in an uncomfortable situation with an older, famous musician she chose not to name publicly, describing him only as a well-known British singer-songwriter. Panettiere wrote that she was able to remove herself from the situation and leave the yacht, but that the sense of betrayal by someone she considered a friend stayed with her for years. She never identified the man involved, and because she chose not to name him, it would be irresponsible to guess or repeat online speculation about his identity. What she did make clear was how vulnerable young performers can be when they depend on adults around them for guidance and protection, and how easily that trust can be misused. Panettiere's openness extended to how fame itself had shaped her emotionally, starting from childhood. She has talked about how her mother brought her to auditions before she was even 5 years old, and about how much her sense of self-worth became tied to whether her mother approved of a performance. As she built a reputation for being able to cry convincingly on camera, directors leaned on that skill again and again, and she has said that over time it became harder to separate genuine emotion from performance, and harder still to leave a character's sadness behind once filming stopped. She connected this pattern to some of the emotional struggles she carried into adulthood and to why therapy eventually became such an important part of her life. She described major life setbacks as lifequakes, a term she used to capture how a single event could reshape her sense of who she was, and she was candid that healing from those moments was not something that happened quickly or all at once. One of the heaviest of those lifequakes arrived in February 2023, when her younger brother, actor Hayden Panettiere, died suddenly at the age of 28. His family later shared that he had died from cardiomegaly, an enlarged heart, along with related aortic valve complications. Panettiere has spoken about how deeply that loss affected her, saying that losing her only sibling felt like losing part of herself, and that the grief was something she expected to carry for the rest of her life. Friends and family later described how the loss of her brother also took a physical toll on her, contributing to a period of increased anxiety and withdrawal in the time that followed. Panettiere's personal life in recent years also included a long, complicated relationship with Brian Hickerson, whom she dated on and off for several years. That relationship had been troubled at points, including a past arrest connected to a domestic violence incident involving the couple, and other public episodes that drew tabloid attention. Despite those difficulties, the two remained connected, and reports indicate they traveled together to South Carolina in the days before her death. It is worth being clear that being present with someone is not evidence of wrongdoing, and authorities have not indicated Hickerson was responsible for what happened. Reports following her death noted that Hickerson and his brother were the ones who found her unresponsive and administered naloxone, a medication used to reverse opioid overdoses, before emergency services arrived. The circumstances of her death itself unfolded quickly and painfully in public. On the afternoon of August 16, 2026, authorities in Greenville, South Carolina responded to a 911 call reporting a woman in cardiac arrest at a residence. Emergency responders performed life-saving measures, but Panettiere was pronounced dead at the scene. Her family confirmed the news later that day. In a statement shared through a representative, her father, Skip Panettiere, described her as an incredible light who brought immeasurable love and joy to everyone who knew her, both personally and through her decades on screen. He asked for privacy for the family as they processed the loss. In the days that followed, the Greenville County Coroner's Office confirmed that an autopsy had been completed and that no signs of trauma were found that would explain her death. Officials stated that the official cause of death remained pending further investigation, including toxicology results, which typically take additional weeks to finalize. Despite that lack of an official cause, several media outlets reported that emergency responders were heard on dispatch audio referencing a possible overdose and cardiac arrest at the scene. It is important to be clear that this was reported speculation based on radio traffic, not a confirmed medical finding, and that jumping to conclusions before toxicology results are released risks spreading information that may turn out to be incomplete or wrong. Authorities have consistently said there were no signs of foul play. The response from Hollywood was immediate and heartfelt. Tributes poured in from people who had worked with her over the years, including her Nashville co-star Connie Britton, who described her as someone who was bursting with brilliance and who shone so bright, and other performers such as Viola Davis, Rosie O'Donnell, and David Arquette shared their own memories publicly. SAG-AFTRA, the union representing television and film performers, also issued a statement mourning her loss and recognizing a career that spanned more than 3 decades, from her earliest days as a child actor through her most recent film work. For an entire generation of viewers who grew up alongside her, watching her move from child roles to teen stardom to more complex adult work, the loss felt personal in a way that is not always true of celebrity deaths. Panettiere's story has also reignited a broader conversation about what happens to children who become famous before they are old enough to understand what fame really means. Child stardom can look like nothing but opportunity from the outside, money, attention, early success, but it also places young people in adult environments long before they have the tools to navigate them. Kids working in entertainment are frequently around adults making decisions on their behalf, traveling constantly, and learning to perform emotionally on command, all while still developmentally figuring out who they are. Panettiere is far from the only performer whose early success came with a steep personal cost. Other former child stars have spoken about similar struggles over the years. Actor River Phoenix became well known as a teenager and died at just 23 after a drug-related overdose, a story that remains one of the more sobering examples of what early fame combined with substance use can lead to. Other former child performers, including Macaulay Culkin and Drew Barrymore, have spoken candidly in later years about the pressures, addiction, and identity struggles that came with growing up on camera, even though both ultimately found ways to rebuild stable adult lives and careers. Panettiere's willingness to talk openly about her own experience, rather than let the public only see the polished version of her career, is part of why so many people responded to her death not just as the loss of an actress, but as the loss of someone who had tried, in her final years, to be honest about what fame had actually cost her. There is also something worth noting about how differently Panettiere handled her own visibility compared to how she was raised in the industry. As a mother herself, she has talked about being conscious of not repeating patterns from her own childhood, wanting to give her daughter room to grow without the same pressure to perform for approval that she remembers feeling. That awareness did not erase the difficulty of her own path, and by her own account she continued to work through the effects of those early years well into adulthood. It does suggest, though, that she was thinking seriously about breaking a cycle rather than simply accepting it as an unavoidable part of the business, which is part of why her memoir resonated with so many readers earlier this year. At the time of her death, Panettiere genuinely seemed to be entering a more hopeful period. She had recently released a film, was promoting a deeply personal memoir, and had spoken about feeling like she had turned a corner after years of difficulty. She talked about leaving behind some of the darkness she had carried and about wanting more life ahead of her. Those comments, made only months before her death, are part of what has made the loss so difficult for people to process. It is a reminder that recovery and healing are rarely a straight line, and that someone can be genuinely working toward a better version of their life while still carrying real risk from the years that came before. As of now, the official cause of Hayden Panettiere's death has not been released, and it likely will not be confirmed until toxicology results are complete. Until that information is available, any specific claims about exactly what happened should be treated as unconfirmed. What is not in question is the impact she had over more than 3 decades in the public eye, and the courage it took to speak as openly as she did about postpartum depression, addiction, grief, and the complicated realities of being famous from childhood. Hayden Panettiere was an actress, a singer, a mother, and someone who spent her final years trying to turn painful experience into something that might help other people feel less alone. That part of her legacy is not in dispute, and it is worth remembering alongside the sadness of how her story ended. If you or someone you know is struggling with substance use, postpartum depression, or feelings of hopelessness, know that support is available and reaching out for help is never something to be ashamed of. Hayden Panettiere's own story, ultimately, is proof of that. She spent decades in an industry that often rewards silence over honesty, and in her final years she chose the opposite path, talking openly about depression, addiction, grief, and the parts of fame that never make it onto a red carpet. That choice does not erase the sadness of how quickly her life ended, but it does mean her story carries more than tragedy. It carries the example of someone who kept trying to be honest, kept trying to heal, and kept believing that better days were still ahead, right up until the very end.